1917, Shoreham, New York. A demolition crew arrives at an abandoned lot on Long Island Sound with cutting torches and crowbars, sent to tear down a wooden tower that has stood empty, unfinished, and silent for more than a decade. The tower is 187 feet tall, taller than most church steeples of its era. At its top sits a hemispherical metal dome roughly 68 feet across and weighing 55 tons, balanced on a wooden frame like an enormous mushroom cap. Beneath the tower, if the rumors from the workers who built it are to be believed, iron pipes and tunnels reach some 300 feet down into the earth. The men arriving with their crowbars are not there to preserve any of it. They are there to strip it for scrap, because the man who built it owes money, and this tower is what is left to pay the debt. The man's name is Nikola Tesla. A decade earlier, the same inventor whose alternating current system already lit cities and spun the generators at Niagara Falls stood at the edge of what he believed would be the greatest leap in the history of communication, a system to send messages, and eventually electrical power itself, through the air and through the ground, without a single wire strung between continents. He bought 200 acres of land for this. He convinced one of the most powerful financiers in the country to bankroll it. And in 1917, workers are melting the remains down for copper and steel, because nobody, including Tesla, could find the money to finish it, or even to keep it standing. Nobody in Shoreham that day would have guessed that the ruins going into the furnace once represented one of the largest private investments an American financier had ever made in a single communications experiment. The architect who designed the main laboratory building beside the tower, Stanford White, was one of the most celebrated designers in the country. The land itself, 200 acres purchased from a local developer, had been chosen specifically because of what supposedly lay beneath it, a shaft reaching some 120 feet straight down into the earth, meant to let the tower grip the planet itself the way a plug grips a socket. None of that ambition survives the demolition. What is left by the time the crew finishes is a cleared lot and a debt that still needs paying. Nobody watching that day would have known that this tower was the final, most extreme escalation in a decades-long, increasingly reckless race to conquer distance, a race that had already broken cables, careers, and fortunes long before Tesla ever set foot on this land. So here is the real question. Not what this tower was. Why did it fail? And why, if you have heard of Nikola Tesla at all, have you probably never heard of this particular chapter of his life? Imagine being the single most trusted financier in the United States, a man whose personal guarantee had already steadied the country's currency during a banking crisis, and deciding to personally bankroll a wireless communication system designed by the engineer who had already out-argued Thomas Edison over which kind of electrical current should power the modern world. That is exactly what the financier John Pierpont Morgan did, signing a contract with Tesla in March of 1901. He was not funding a hobbyist chasing a fantasy. He was funding a proven inventor with hundreds of patents already reshaping how electricity moved through American cities. And yet within 5 years the project was abandoned, its founder unable to raise another dollar to finish it. Within 16 years, it was scrap metal. The man who had already electrified a continent could not complete a single tower on Long Island. The easy answer is Tesla ran out of money, and that much is true, but it is not the interesting answer. The interesting answer sits inside a much larger, decades-long contest that Tesla walked into rather than started, a contest to solve one specific, brutally expensive problem. How do you move a message, and eventually electrical power itself, across an ocean without physically carrying it there? Before Tesla ever poured a foundation at Wardenclyffe, other inventors, financiers, and outright gamblers had already tried, failed, half-succeeded, and escalated the stakes for nearly half a century. Tesla's tower was never meant to be the opening move of that contest. It was supposed to be the finishing one, bigger, stranger, and more complete than everything that came before it combined. To understand why it collapsed instead, we need to go back to the very first, clumsiest attempts to solve the same problem, and watch the solutions grow larger, stranger, and more dangerous with each attempt, until they arrive, inevitably, at a single tower rising out of a Long Island potato field. There is a second inventor hovering at the edge of this whole story, and he matters as much as Tesla does. His name was Guglielmo Marconi, and by the time Morgan signed his contract with Tesla, Marconi was already quietly winning a race Tesla did not fully realize he was running. Keep him in mind. He will not appear as the villain of this story. There is no villain here, only escalating ambition colliding with a limited amount of money and time, but his timing will turn out to matter more than almost anything else in it. Picture the mid-1800s. The fastest way to move a message from London to New York is a ship. Even the quickest packet steamships of the era took about 10 days to cross the Atlantic. 10 days for a letter. 10 days for news of an election result, a market crash, a death in the family, a change in government policy. Businesses priced that delay into every transatlantic deal they made. Merchants insured cargo against risks that had often already resolved themselves, one way or another, by the time the paperwork crossed the ocean. It was simply the accepted cost of having an ocean between two continents. This was not a minor inconvenience tucked into the margins of history. It was one of the defining bottlenecks of the industrial age. Stock prices in London and New York could diverge for over a week with nobody able to correct the imbalance. Diplomatic instructions and shipping insurance rates traveled slower than the very events they were meant to respond to. An entire branch of 19th century commerce existed solely to exploit the simple fact that information could not move faster than a hull through water. By the 1850s, a small number of engineers, investors, and outright gamblers had become convinced that this bottleneck was not some fixed law of nature. It was an engineering problem. And engineering problems, however expensive, could be solved with enough capital, enough wire, and enough willingness to fail in public over and over until something finally worked. Existing telegraph companies on land had already proven the basic principle worked beautifully on solid ground, wiring together cities across entire countries. It was the ocean itself that stood as the last, most stubborn gap on the map, a barrier no wire on land had ever needed to cross, because no wire on land ever had to survive underwater pressure, saltwater corrosion, and thousands of miles of unmapped seafloor between two shores. What followed was not one invention, but a ladder of escalating attempts, each one larger, more expensive, and more technically audacious than the last. First, wooden ships loaded with hundreds of miles of copper cable sunk to the bottom of an ocean nobody had properly mapped. Then wireless stations powerful enough to be heard on the far side of that same ocean, with no cable at all. Then artificial lightning bolts taller than a 10-story building, built specifically to prove a theory about the ground beneath our feet. And finally, a single tower on Long Island, attempting to do everything the others had done, combined, at once. That ladder is where our story actually begins, not with Tesla, but with a paper merchant from New York who knew almost nothing about telegraphy and decided, against most advice, to lay a cable across the floor of the Atlantic Ocean anyway. The man's name was Cyrus Field, and by his mid-30s he had already made a fortune in the paper business, wealthy enough to consider retiring. He knew shockingly little about electrical engineering. What he understood was opportunity, and in the 1850s, after conversations with an engineer proposing a Newfoundland telegraph line, the bigger opportunity became obvious to him. Connect Europe and North America directly with a telegraph cable, and you collapse 10 days of ocean travel into a matter of minutes. It was far harder than Field expected. The first attempt, in 1857, snapped after roughly 400 miles of cable had already been paid out, lost to the ocean floor, along with a serious portion of the project's funding. Field tried again, and again. Contemporary accounts describe 4 separate cable failures in total before a 5th attempt finally succeeded, the ships reaching Newfoundland and Ireland respectively on the 5th of August, 1858. For a moment, it looked like an unqualified triumph. On the 16th of August, Queen Victoria sent President James Buchanan a formal telegraphic greeting, 98 words of diplomatic pleasantry. It took nearly 16 hours to transmit. Compared to a 10-day ocean crossing, 16 hours felt like a miracle. New York City held a fireworks celebration so enthusiastic that a stray spark reportedly set part of City Hall on fire. Tiffany and Company sold off leftover pieces of the cable as souvenirs to a public convinced the world had just changed forever. Then, within about 3 weeks, the line died completely. The cause was not mysterious, at least in hindsight. The project's chief electrician, Wildman Whitehouse, had been pushing dangerously high voltages through the line in an attempt to force faster transmission speeds, and the cable's thin copper core and insulation simply could not survive it. Some contemporaries refused to believe the cable had ever genuinely worked at all, and rumors spread that the whole achievement had been an elaborate stock fraud, a claim worth naming clearly as an unproven rumor, not a fact, because it was never substantiated by any formal investigation. A British inquiry did later place the blame squarely on Whitehouse's flawed engineering decisions rather than on any conspiracy. What was real, and sadder than any fraud story, was much simpler: a genuine technical achievement, undone within weeks by one engineer's impatience, and a financial disaster for nearly everyone who had believed in it. The public celebration had been sincere. The collapse that followed it was just as sincere and just as public. Most of Field's original backers wanted nothing more to do with transatlantic cables after watching their investment turn into 1858's expensive, humiliating anticlimax. Field kept going anyway. It took years to rebuild confidence and capital, and when he finally returned to the project, he did it with a genuinely staggering piece of equipment: the SS Great Eastern, at the time the largest ship ever built, measuring roughly 693 feet long and 120 feet wide, with a hull large enough to carry 18,000 tons of cargo in a single vessel, finally big enough to carry an entire ocean's length of cable, without needing two ships to splice their loads together in open water partway across. An 1865 attempt still ended in failure. The cable lost roughly 600 miles short of Newfoundland after months of preparation. But in July of 1866, the Great Eastern tried once more, and this time the cable held. It landed at Heart's Content, Newfoundland, and stayed alive. The ship then sailed back to the exact spot where the previous year's cable had snapped and vanished, dragged the ocean floor until it found the broken end, spliced it, and finished laying that line too, meaning that by September of 1866, there were not one, but two separate functioning telegraph lines running beneath the Atlantic. The improvement in performance was not subtle. The doomed 1858 cable had managed roughly 1/10 of a word per minute at its best. The new 1866 cable could carry about 8 words per minute, roughly 80 times faster. A diplomatic message that once took the better part of a day to transmit now took a matter of minutes. It was proof, finally and permanently, that an ocean could be beaten with enough copper, enough insulation, and enough sheer stubbornness on the part of one paper merchant who refused to accept impossible as a final answer. Cyrus Field was celebrated for it. He received a gold medal from the United States Congress and international recognition for finally closing the gap he had spent 12 years and 5 separate expeditions trying to close. It is worth remembering that name and that triumph, because Field's story will not end there, and neither, in a very different way, will the story of the next man to take on this same problem. But copper cable, however triumphant, was still a physical tether, thousands of miles of wire that had to be manufactured, shipped, and laid with surgical precision along an unmapped ocean floor, vulnerable to breaking again at literally any point along its length. Within a few decades, a young Italian experimenter would look at all of that expensive, fragile infrastructure and ask a far stranger question. What if you did not need the wire at all? His name was Guglielmo Marconi, and unlike Cyrus Field, he actually understood the physics involved. He began experimenting with wireless telegraphy in the early 1890s, and what makes his story worth watching closely is not any single breakthrough, but the sheer rate of escalation. In 1895, working at his father's country estate in Italy, he managed to send a wireless signal roughly 1.5 miles. That same year, he demonstrated the same idea to the Italian government at La Spezia, this time reaching a distance of about 12 miles. He did not stop there. Over the next several years, working now in Britain, where his experiments found more financial support, Marconi kept pushing the range outward in a steady, almost mechanical progression. About 4 miles, then 9 miles, then nearly 12 miles again under different conditions, then 31 miles, then 75 miles. In 1896, he patented his wireless telegraphy device in Britain. The following year, he founded a company to manufacture it. By 1899, he had bridged the English Channel itself, establishing wireless communication between France and England. And that same year, his equipment began appearing aboard ocean-going ships for testing, with commercial shipping companies adopting it soon after. Then, in January of 1901, on the south coast of England, Marconi sent and received a signal across roughly 186 miles. In under a decade, he had gone from 1.5 miles at his family's estate to well over 100 miles across open country without laying a single foot of undersea cable. Telegraph companies that had spent fortunes on copper wire strung across ocean floors were suddenly watching a competitor who needed nothing but 2 towers and open air. This was not a welcome development for everyone. The companies that owned those expensive undersea cables had sunk enormous sums of money into their infrastructure over decades, and they had no interest in watching a young experimenter with a few towers and no seafloor rights make that entire investment obsolete. Marconi's wireless system faced real commercial resistance from the very telegraph industry it was about to threaten, a contrast worth sitting with. One side had spent a fortune burying wire under an ocean, and the other side was trying to prove none of that wire had ever been strictly necessary. By this point, Marconi had one obvious, enormous target left on his list: the same ocean that had taken Cyrus Field 12 years and 5 separate expeditions to conquer with cable. Marconi believed he could cross it with nothing but radio waves. Many serious scientists of the era doubted this was even physically possible, since radio waves were assumed to travel in straight lines, and the Earth's curvature should have made any signal sent that far simply fly off into space long before it reached the other side. Marconi decided to try anyway. Marconi built a powerful transmitting station at Poldhu, on the coast of Cornwall in England, and set out for St. John's, Newfoundland, to attempt the reception himself. The plan called for something almost comically simple by the standards of what came before. His station at Poldhu would repeatedly transmit a single Morse code letter, S, 3 short clicks, chosen specifically because it was the easiest possible pattern to distinguish from background noise. The first attempts to catch that signal on the Newfoundland side went badly. A kite carrying the receiving antenna broke loose in high winds. A balloon meant to hold the antenna aloft also broke free and was lost. A second kite was torn away by a gale. Finally, on the 12th of December, 1901, a kite trailing 500 feet of antenna wire managed to stay up long enough for Marconi and his assistant, George Kemp, to press a telephone earpiece to their ears and listen. Through the static, they reported hearing it. 3 faint clicks, over and over, sent from more than 2,000 miles away. The announcement stunned the world. It also invited real skepticism at the time, and that skepticism has never fully gone away. The only witness to the reception was Marconi's own assistant, hardly an impartial observer, and the signal was far too weak to trigger any kind of automatic recording device that could serve as independent proof. Some historians examining the case in later decades have suggested Marconi may have picked up nothing more than atmospheric static or interference, mistaken in the excitement of the moment for the pattern he was listening for. It is worth stating plainly, whether Marconi truly heard what he believed he heard remains disputed among historians to this day, and treating it as settled fact would be dishonest. What is not disputed is that within a couple of months, Marconi produced a version of the same feat with recorded, independently witnessed evidence, and by then the world had already decided to believe him. Marconi himself seemed to sense that the Newfoundland reception needed stronger proof. 2 months later, in February of 1902, he ran a more rigorous set of tests aboard a ship sailing westward from Britain, this time using a recording instrument rather than a human ear pressed to a telephone earpiece. According to his own later account, the equipment picked up readable messages at distances of up to roughly 1,500 miles, and detected simple test signals at distances beyond 2,000 miles, with reception noticeably stronger at night than during the day. It was not a perfect resolution to the controversy, but it gave skeptics something closer to physical evidence than 3 clicks heard by 2 men on a windswept hill. News of the achievement spread across the globe within days. ironically carried in large part over the very undersea telegraph cables Marconi's technology was about to make obsolete. And somewhere in New York, a very different inventor, backed by a very different fortune, was about to feel the ground shift underneath a tower he had barely started building. Before any of that collision happened, Tesla had already spent a season doing something considerably stranger than either Field or Marconi had attempted. In 1899, he convinced the wealthy investor John Jacob Astor IV to put up $100,000 toward what Astor understood to be funding for a new wireless lighting system. Tesla used the money instead to build an experimental station on a stretch of open land outside Colorado Springs, chosen specifically for its high altitude, thin air, and frequent lightning storms. What he built there was, by any measure, extreme. The laboratory housed the largest Tesla coil ever constructed up to that point, roughly 50 feet in diameter, feeding into an even larger magnifying transmitter 52 feet across. A central mast rose 142 feet into the air, topped with a 30-inch copper-covered sphere. Tesla's goal was not communication in the conventional sense. He wanted to prove that the Earth itself could act as a conductor, carrying electrical energy the way a copper wire does, which would mean power, not just messages, could eventually be sent anywhere on the planet without any wire at all. The results, when he switched the equipment on, were less like an experiment and more like a demonstration of controlled catastrophe. The station produced artificial lightning bolts up to 135 feet long, discharges carrying millions of volts, with thunder from the largest bolts reportedly audible up to 15 miles away. At one point, the surges knocked out power across Colorado Springs entirely and did serious damage to equipment belonging to the local electric company that had been supplying Tesla with free current, which understandably ended that arrangement rather quickly. Marconi, by comparison, was working with a table of delicate receiving equipment and a kite. Tesla was generating bolts of electricity large enough to be mistaken for genuine storms. It is a genuine escalation, not just in scale but in kind. Marconi was trying to send a whisper across an ocean, while Tesla was trying to prove the entire planet could be turned into one enormous electrical circuit. Tesla kept a meticulous diary of the entire stay, eventually running to roughly 500 pages and 200 drawings. Buried in those pages is one claim worth flagging clearly as a claim and nothing more. Tesla later wrote that his receiving equipment had picked up strange, rhythmic signals during the experiments, and he speculated, without any real evidence to support it, that the pattern might have originated from somewhere beyond Earth. No serious modern investigation supports that interpretation, and it belongs in this story as a curiosity about Tesla's own imagination, not as an established fact. He left Colorado Springs in January of 1900, convinced by what he had seen about the Earth's conductivity, if not about signals from other worlds. What he needed next was somewhere large enough and someone wealthy enough to build the real thing. That someone was John Pierpont Morgan, and the site Tesla chose was 200 acres of land on Long Island Sound, purchased from a local developer named James Warden, in a village that would take on his name, Wardenclyffe. Morgan signed a contract with Tesla in March of 1901, and by the terms Tesla proposed, this was meant to be a wireless communications station, a rival to Marconi's growing network, nothing more exotic than that. Morgan committed $150,000. Tesla hired the same architectural firm behind some of the era's most prestigious buildings, McKim, Mead, and White, with Stanford White personally overseeing the tower's design. Construction began in September of 1901. By June of 1902, Tesla had moved his laboratory operations out of Manhattan entirely and into a 94-foot square brick building on the Wardenclyffe grounds. By the end of that year, the wooden tower beside it had reached its full height of 187 feet, crowned with the hemispherical dome that would later be scrapped for its metal. Wardenclyffe, in Tesla's own private vision, was never meant to be a single tower at all. He had described it, in his own writing, as the intended hub of a worldwide system of some 30 wireless plants, each one capable of sending messages, news, and eventually electrical power to any point on the globe. Morgan had signed a contract to fund one communications station. Tesla was quietly building the prototype for something closer to a planetary utility company, and had not made the difference entirely clear to the man paying for it. But privately, Tesla had already expanded the project's ambitions far beyond what Morgan had agreed to fund. The tower was not simply meant to send messages. It was designed to combine everything Tesla had learned across every previous case in this story. Marconi's wireless signaling, Colorado Springs' proof that the Earth could carry current, and a scale of physical construction that dwarfed anything either of those earlier efforts had attempted. Beneath the tower, iron pipes extended roughly 300 feet down into the ground, intended to let the whole structure grip the planet the way his Colorado mast had gripped the open sky. Power for the entire system was to come from a 200-kilowatt coal-fired industrial generator. Tesla was no longer building a transmitter. He was attempting to build a machine that could make the entire Earth ring like a bell, and quietly hoping Morgan would keep paying for it without asking too many questions about what, exactly, his money was now funding. Morgan started asking those questions almost immediately, and the timing could not have been worse for Tesla. In December of 1901, while Wardenclyffe's tower was still just a skeleton of timber rising out of a Long Island field, news broke that Marconi had reportedly sent a wireless signal clear across the Atlantic Ocean, the very feat Tesla had told Morgan his own system would achieve, using a fraction of the money and none of Tesla's elaborate infrastructure. Whatever the truth of Marconi's claim, the world believed it, and Tesla's pitch to Morgan had just been publicly upstaged by a rival working out of a shed with a kite. Morgan, meanwhile, had begun to realize that the system he had funded as a communications project was quietly becoming something else entirely, a wireless power transmission scheme that would require vastly more money than originally promised, built without his approval. He was not pleased. Layered on top of that, the broader financial climate had turned against Tesla. A stock market panic in the spring of 1901 had already unsettled American finance, and money that might once have flowed easily toward an ambitious young inventor's second act grew far more cautious. Morgan refused Tesla's requests for additional funding. Tesla kept writing him letters anyway, describing his financial desperation and insisting his system would still outperform anything Marconi could build, at one point confiding to Stanford White that he was facing foreclosure on the project entirely. What followed was less a single dramatic collapse than a long, grinding stall. Tesla, still unwilling to abandon the idea, explored scaled-up alternatives even as the money ran out, at one point considering towers 300 feet tall, or even 600 feet, with Stanford White calculating that a 600-foot version alone would cost roughly $450,000, several times what Morgan had already committed to the entire original project. No one was willing to fund it. During the last week of July, 1903, residents near the Shoreham site witnessed what turned out to be the only real test of Tesla's equipment the facility ever ran. Within days, creditors from the Westinghouse Company confiscated his heavier equipment over unpaid bills. By 1906, construction and testing had stopped for good, with no operational transmission of the kind Tesla had promised ever documented. The contrast is worth stating plainly, because it is the whole point of this chapter of the story. Marconi's transatlantic breakthrough, whatever the truth of what he actually heard, had cost him a kite, a length of wire, and a modest transmitting station. Tesla's answer to the same basic problem had cost 200 acres of land, one of the era's top architectural firms, a coal-fired industrial generator, a 55-ton dome, and years of a fortune's worth of Morgan's patience, and it never worked in public even once. The tower Tesla had built to prove the whole Earth could carry his signal simply stood there afterward, unfinished, its debts unpaid, for over a decade, until the demolition crew from our opening scene finally arrived to take it apart for scrap. Here is the quiet irony underneath everything that happened at Wardenclyffe. The problem Tesla was trying to solve did get solved, within a couple of decades, but not by anything resembling a giant tower gripping the Earth. It was solved by a glass tube roughly the size of a light bulb. In 1906, an American inventor named Lee De Forest patented a three-element vacuum tube he called the Audion, the first practical device capable of taking a weak electrical signal and amplifying it into a strong one. It sounds unglamorous compared to artificial lightning bolts and 55-ton domes, but its consequences were enormous. Amplification meant a radio transmitter no longer needed to generate the kind of raw, brute force power Tesla had chased at Colorado Springs and Wardenclyffe. A comparatively small signal could be boosted electronically, cheaply, and repeated along a line or broadcast to an entire city, without ever needing the Earth itself to act as a conductor. By the early 1920s, radio broadcasting stations using tube-based amplification were reaching ordinary households across entire countries, using towers a tiny fraction of the size and cost of what Tesla had attempted. The second half of Tesla's dream, sending electrical power itself through the air or the ground, not just messages, fared far worse, and in a sense still has not caught up to what he imagined. Wireless power transmission never became the everyday reality Tesla predicted for the 20th century. It survived instead in small, humble corners: short-range charging pads for phones and toothbrushes, contactless payment chips, radio frequency tags that light up only when a scanner passes within inches of them. All of it works on the same underlying physics Tesla was chasing. None of it works at anything close to the scale or the distance he was trying to build in Shoreham. The tower did not fail because the idea was insane. It failed because the specific, planet-sized version of the idea Tesla insisted on building was decades, if not longer, ahead of what the available engineering and the available money could actually deliver. By the time our opening scene happens, the tower had already been standing empty for roughly 11 years, an increasingly weathered landmark on Long Island that neighbors had grown used to seeing rise out of the trees. In 1917, it was finally torn down and sold for scrap, the proceeds going toward the debts Tesla still owed. It was not treated as a historic structure or a curiosity worth preserving. It was treated as raw material. Even the land itself did not stay in Tesla's hands. In 1922, the Wardenclyffe property was taken from him entirely through foreclosure, following mortgages Tesla had quietly taken out and kept off the public record, specifically so nobody would learn how deep his financial trouble had actually become. The site that had once represented one of the largest privately funded scientific gambles in American history passed out of his ownership completely. What happened to the land afterward is almost stranger than the tower's demolition. Ownership passed through a Brooklyn buyer in the mid-1920s, and then, in 1939, the property was leased to a company called Peerless Photo Products, which spent the next several decades manufacturing light-sensitive coatings for photographic film and paper on the very ground where Tesla had once tried to make the Earth itself carry electricity. In 1969, the operation was absorbed into Agfa Gevaert, a much larger photographic company, which kept the factory running until finally shutting it down in 1987. Decades of industrial chemical use left the soil and groundwater contaminated with silver, cadmium, and other hazardous byproducts, and the site sat closed and quietly toxic for years afterward, subject to a lengthy, state-supervised environmental cleanup before anyone could responsibly do anything else with the land. Through all of it, remarkably, the original 94-foot brick laboratory building Stanford White had designed to sit beside the tower kept standing, sturdy enough and unremarkable enough that nobody ever bothered tearing it down. The three men at the center of this story ended up in strikingly different places, and the gap between them says something worth sitting with honestly, without exaggerating any of it. Guglielmo Marconi's career only grew from here. In 1909, he received the Nobel Prize in Physics, sharing the honor with the German physicist Carl Ferdinand Braun, and spent the following decades as one of the most celebrated scientific figures in the world, his name permanently attached to the birth of radio. Cyrus Field's ending was quieter and considerably less kind. The man whose stubbornness had finally beaten the Atlantic Ocean went on, in his later years, to lose much of his own fortune in unrelated Wall Street ventures. He died in 1892 in New York, having spent his final years in financial difficulty rather than continued triumph, a footnote most people who use the word telegraph today have never heard. Tesla's later decades were the hardest of the three. The staggering debts left behind by Wardenclyffe never fully resolved, and his reputation, once comparable to Edison's, faded from mainstream public attention for much of the rest of his life, even as his earlier alternating current patents kept powering the country around him. He continued working and filing patents into his 70s, largely out of the public eye, and died in January of 1943 in a New York City hotel room, having outlived the peak of his own fame by decades. It is a genuinely uncomfortable fact, worth stating plainly rather than dramatizing. The man whose inventions underpin the electrical grid much of the modern world still runs on, spent his final years largely forgotten by the public that depended on his earlier work every single day. Recognition did eventually come back around, just far too late to help him. In 1960, an international conference of scientists formally adopted the Tesla as the standard unit of magnetic flux density, permanently attaching his name to the metric system itself, a kind of honor Marconi never received, and Cyrus Field certainly never received either. It does not undo the fact that Tesla died with his most ambitious project standing as an unfinished, foreclosed ruin. It simply means the correction, when it finally arrived generations after the man who earned it could benefit from it in any way. The brick laboratory building Stanford White designed is still standing today in Shoreham, New York, and it is the only one of Tesla's laboratories anywhere in the world that has survived intact. For decades after the photographic factory closed in 1987, the site sat behind a fence, overgrown and largely forgotten, its future genuinely uncertain while the required environmental cleanup dragged on. Then, in 2012, a grassroots campaign, organized partly through an online fundraiser backed by a popular internet cartoonist, set out to buy the property before it could be sold off to a developer. The campaign raised roughly $1.25 million, and in May of 2013, the nonprofit Tesla Science Center at Wardenclyffe successfully purchased the 16-acre site, tower base and all. In 2018, the property was formally added to the National Register of Historic Places, and the group has spent the years since slowly restoring it, clearing decades of overgrowth away from the brick walls, preserving the concrete octagonal foundation where the tower itself once stood, and even installing a statue of Tesla near the entrance. So here is where we land. Somewhere in your home, right now, there is very likely a small box quietly filling the air around it with radio waves, letting your phone, your laptop, and half a dozen other devices talk to each other and to the wider world without a single wire connecting them. If you charge your phone by simply setting it on a pad instead of plugging it in, you are using a miniature, short-range descendant of the exact physics Tesla bankrupted himself trying to build at planetary scale. None of it looks like a 187-foot tower with a 55-ton dome. None of it required grounding a shaft 300 feet into the earth. It works because engineers, over the following century, broke Tesla's enormous, unified dream into 1,000 smaller, more modest, more achievable pieces, and quietly built each of those pieces separately, without any of them needing to bankrupt a J.P. Morgan to do it. Next time your phone finds a wireless network without you thinking twice about it, that quiet, invisible handoff is standing on the wreckage, quite literally, of a tower a very brilliant, very stubborn man could never finish. If you want more stories like this one, real engineering history, the failures as much as the triumphs, told with the actual numbers and without the myths, subscribe and hit like if this one held your attention the whole way through. And here is the specific question for the comments. What other beautiful failure of infrastructure history deserves this same kind of deep dive? Maybe it is an early transcontinental railroad scheme that went bankrupt before a single mile was profitable. Maybe it is a city's abandoned pneumatic mail tube network. Maybe it is an entire canal project that ran out of money halfway across a continent. Drop the name below, and it might be the next tower we take apart, piece by piece. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.